I'm Diane Hibino. I'm the co-president of the Montgomery League of Women Voters. And I'm happy to see that you came out tonight in January. I see most of you are members, but some of you may be guests. Anybody here not a member of the League of Women Voters? Okay, a few people. Good. Thank you for coming, and I hope you consider joining the League. This year is an exciting year. It's 2020. It is our 100th anniversary year. We celebrate the 19th Amendment, the passing of votes for women, although, as you all know, not all women became voters with the 19th Amendment. And we will celebrate in February 14th the founding of the League of Women Voters, the National League of Women Voters. And in April, we are going to have our gala because that's our birthday month. And it's going to be April 18th in Rockville. Mark your calendars. It is our annual fundraiser. We're calling it the Giving Campaign, 100 Gifts for Our 100 Years. Okay. 2020 is also an election year. And on March 7th, Saturday, our Regional League of Women Voters of the National Capital Area is holding an election forum. Election 2020, the challenges ahead. And the morning session will be on news and how we get news today. And what can we believe and what we can't believe. And in the afternoon, it'll be getting out the vote, which is very important. A lot of us register new voters, but then how do we take the next step and make sure that voters actually get to the polls? But 2020 is also the census year. And we are working with the county's Complete Census Committee, and we are supporting them by helping people in the county to submit their census forms online. And we do need some more volunteers. I have this that I'm going to pass around. Judy Davis, put your hand up. You're you're the chair of the committee. Co-chair with
Cynthia.
Cynthia, put your hand up too. Cynthia in the back. And they're looking for volunteers who might spend maybe a couple hours, 3 hours, from any time you pick a date between mid-March to kind of early April to help folks fill out the census form. So if you have a chance, please fill it out, put your name down there, and we will help people with their census forms. The next trending topics is February 24th on pedestrian safety. It'll be here. I'm looking at Kathleen. It'll be here in the Rockville Library as well. So it's February 24th at 6:45. Those are the announcements for this evening. Now I'm here to introduce Dr. Eric Hershberg, who is the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at the American University. He's also a professor of government there. And from 2007 to 2009, he was president of the Latin American Studies Association, while serving also as professor of political science and director of Latin American Studies at Simon Fraser University in beautiful Vancouver, Canada. I've seen that. And earlier, from 1990 to 2006, he worked as program director at the Social Science Research Council in New York City, and he received his PhD at Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research has focused primarily on the comparative politics of Latin America and on the political economy of development in the region. Very important. Most recently, he has conducted studies on community integration of Central American migrants in various parts of the U.S. So he knows Latin America, he knows the movement and development and the migrants here. So, Dr. Hershberg,
thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Were you in Vancouver on the sunny day?
Yes.
I was there too for 3 years. There were 2 sunny days. It is in fact a beautiful place. But I came back to the eastern part of the United States.
Excuse me, you just said life's nice.
There you go. Vancouver is in fact one of the most beautiful places, certainly in North America. The problem is you rarely can see that because of the deep clouds. But thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity. We have, in fact, at the Center for Latin American Latino Studies that I direct at American University, have been carrying out a series of studies over the years on Central American development, but also on the Central American migration and the incorporation of migrants into communities around the United States.
So just to contextualize this presentation, when I came to American University nearly 10 years ago to begin an interdisciplinary research center, I began a project with researchers at AU and economists and political scientists at think tanks in Central America with whom I'd worked for some years. It was supported by the Ford Foundation, and the objective was a political economy objective, which was to try to understand the relationship between the strategies of economic elites in Central America and the difficulties that those countries had had in developing in an inclusive manner, in generating jobs, in generating decent living conditions, and so on. And we were trying to emphasize in those studies, we really weren't thinking of anything having to do with migration. We were thinking in those studies about what is it about Central American capitalism that seems to make it incapable of generating the kind of social inclusion that one wants. And we thought you needed to really focus on the strategies of elites for generating resources and for concentrating those resources. And so we carried out a series of studies, a series of books came out of that from around 2013 to 15. But around 2013, some of you will remember that there began what became known as the migrant crisis, the surge of unaccompanied youth migrants arriving at the US border. Now, of course, migration had been going on for quite some time. And I'll show you a slide about this in a second. This is the foreign-born population from Central America residing in the United States. And what you'll see is that beginning in the 1980s, you see a modest increase. This is during the period of civil wars in Central America. In the 90s, that continues. Keep in mind that you now have communities in Central America who can receive relatives and neighbors and so on. But then we see quite the spike as we enter into the 21st century, and that has continued to this date, right? You see this graph divides country by country, right? And it was in the summer of 13 that the media in the United States, not to mention political environment in the United States, started to focus on the arrival of tens of thousands of children, unaccompanied. They were known as unaccompanied alien children, UACs in the Department of Homeland Security lexicon. And then increasingly it became clear there were also families arriving, women with children typically, but sometimes men as well. And this became a major political issue in the United States. Remember that this was at a period in 13 where Obama still thought that he could get a comprehensive immigration reform through the Republican Senate, if only he'd show he was tough at the border, right? And so he was still trying to deal with that. And this was the environment in which this inflow of people to the border made it to the headlines. The issue here, though, was that this was a migration of a very different sort from what we had grown accustomed over the decades. Historically, the largest source of migrants crossing at the U.S. southern border without papers was Mexican primarily, and to some extent Central American, largely male, looking for work. This was a very different population. These were people who were fleeing from very different kinds of circumstances, looking for opportunity, looking for safety, but very different kinds of circumstances. And in that context, I started getting calls from foundations in particular. The Ford Foundation had funded our political economy work, saying that the Ford Foundation is funding all of these immigrant service organizations, and we don't understand where these folks are coming from and why. Given that you've been doing all these studies, can you address the drivers of this immigration flow? And it was in that context that I began working on a topic that wasn't my area of focus historically, which was on the causes of migration flows, I would argue, in this instance, echoing Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, here, who notes that what we have here is one of the major refugee crises of the 21st century, of the early 21st century. We tend to think about refugee crises in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa, as Guterres says in this quote, which was drawn from when he was head of the UN High Commission on Refugees before moving to the Secretary General position, that the great refugee crises are also present here in the Americas. And he was speaking at the time in 2015 of Central America. Of course, he's got a second one now, which some of you will be aware of certainly, that we have now 4 million Venezuelans, which is really an unprecedented humanitarian emergency in the Western Hemisphere. But this is the context in which colleagues and I began moving away from our work on the political economy of development and into situating that work in the context of the very substantial flow of Central Americans, particularly families and children, beginning in the middle of, beginning 5 years or so ago. And it is in the context of that continuing flow that there is a backlog of around 1 million cases in American immigration courts now, as people try to have their claims adjudicated by American immigration courts. Our office now does 3 or 4 reports per month in support of requests for asylum, where we go into the detail of the country conditions that the asylum applicants are requesting. Those cases are increasingly 3 and 4 years out, as there's the backup in the immigration courts. Unless they're detained, in which case they're immediate, but that's a separate talk. So the Northern Triangle of Central America is the focus here. The Northern Triangle are 3 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That's where the overwhelming majority of the migrants are coming from. When we think about the political economy of Central America as scholars, we don't include Panama and Costa Rica for various reasons, but they basically don't have the underlying pattern of economic development and economic exclusion that is common to the Northern Triangle and Nicaragua. But Nicaragua is not a major migrant sending source to the United States. Instead, Nicaraguans go to Costa Rica. In addition, Nicaragua has not until the last couple of years, where there's been major political confrontations, political repression, has not had the same issue of criminal violence as you've had in the Northern Triangle countries. So when we're talking about the drivers of migration and the sources of migration in the United States from Central America, we're talking about Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So again, I showed you this slide earlier as we were working on the sound. This is simply gives you a sense of the trajectory of the Central American population living in the United States. In the context of Central Americans having been here for a long time, various kinds of immigration status have come into play. One that you'll be aware of, and it's particularly important for Salvadorans and Hondurans, is temporary protected status, or TPS. And you may recall that TPS was granted years ago, and it's a sort of temporary, that is, it's renewed every 18 months, status that enables one to work legally, enables one to start businesses, take out mortgages, build one's lives in the United States, with the justification that the country from which one hails has experienced a natural disaster or civil war or what have you that makes it impossible for it to have you to accommodate your return. And so in 1999, there was a devastating hurricane in Honduras, Hurricane Mitch. And so Hondurans who were in the United States in good standing at that point became eligible for temporary protected status. And that was renewed over and over and over again, and people became embedded in their communities, raised families, and so on and so forth. Many of you know and have neighbors who had TPS from Honduras or from El Salvador, because El Salvador then had a major earthquake in 2000, at which point most Salvadorans who had been here prior to that also received TPS. And it was always assumed that TPS is something that's just going to get renewed every year and a half. Until there was an unanticipated event, which was the election of Donald Trump, and of a particular kind of let's call it white nationalist project in the executive branch. And they moved very strongly to say they weren't going to renew TPS. Now, this has gone back and forth. This slide is actually incorrect. It says that there were 195,000, that's about right, Salvadorans who had TPS, and the current expiration date, January 2. No, it was postponed again into, I believe, the end of this year. But Trump announced that he was getting rid of TPS for Salvadorans and also for Hondurans. At this juncture, I don't know that he's extended the Honduran beyond where it was supposed to expire this month. But here we have around 250,000 Central Americans who are losing their status with regard to temporary protected role. But I want to focus more on the current wave of migration and the factors that are driving it. Now, this figure here, you don't have to look at a micro level at what's being shown. This is simply a map of the Northern Triangle, and the size of the circles depicts the volume of migration of unaccompanied youth at around 2014. And this geography maps very closely on what we would find up to the present when we see more families actually than unaccompanied children. They're typically coming in family units, as the Homeland Security refers. And what's interesting about this, first of all, is that you see major concentrations in urban areas. And if you drill down urban areas in Honduras, which would be San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa, in El Salvador would be particularly San Salvador, Guatemala City in Guatemala. But what's interesting is note that it's not just in those urban concentrations, right? That you see these are close to countrywide, even while there are some places of particular concentration. We can talk more about this, but it has to do in part with the dynamics of violence in urban spaces. But the fact that it's generalizing means that parts of the country that were relatively isolated from urban and criminal violence, or that were, in the Guatemalan case, relatively food self-sufficient, are now experiencing challenges on both of those. So this is just a sense of where the migration is coming from. Here's something where we did a study of Salvador, where we pointed out that while population is concentrated in the capital city of San Salvador, by 2014, you're seeing the migration coming countrywide. And there's studies from colleagues of ours in El Salvador who note that this coincides with the gangs, particularly MS-13 and Barrio, having developed national strategies, not in the sense of national reach, national scale, right? That they were no longer simply operating in the shanty towns of the urban core, right? But they were rather trying to control territory across the national space. Now, the question that I'm going to focus mostly on here today, which is I understood the preferred focus, is first of all, what's driving people out? And secondly, then, what, if anything, can be done, can the United States do about this? So I'll touch first of all on what's driving people out. First of all, put this in historical context and think about where the Northern Triangle is located. First of all, keep in mind that this was a major battleground for the Cold War, right? The Cold War was cold here, it was cold in the Soviet Union, it was not cold in Central America. There were very savage wars fought in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, that had to do with the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for hearts and minds. And in that process, societies were turned upside down. People were forced to leave their places of residence. There was terrible violence. And this is really when that Central American migration begins, right? The Central American migration to the United States that I showed on this slide, right? It's beginning in the 1980s, driven by the war and the dislocation that the wars bring about. But if you look at this map, it's not only that that Central America was located in a place where the Soviets and Cubans on the one hand and the Americans and their allies on the others were struggling to exercise influence. It's also a zone that is extraordinarily prone to natural disasters, not only of the sorts as the earthquake in El Salvador in 2000, the earthquake in Nicaragua in 1972, which did in the Somoza regime. Didn't fall till 79, but it was all about the aftershocks, no pun intended, of the 72 earthquake and the ways in which it really brought down that political system. And natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate, given the location in adjacent to the Caribbean. It's a Caribbean region experiencing severe tropical storms and hurricanes in countries where large segments of the population live in substandard housing, vulnerable to mudslides, to flooding, and so on. So there's a natural context here that is also part of what explains the precariousness, the vulnerability of populations in the region. Of course, also Central America has the misfortune to be located right in the middle of the corridor that brings illicit products of all sorts, but particularly narcotics, from South America to the principal consumption market, which is North America. So 90% of all the cocaine that arrives in the United States goes through Honduras. That's not good for Honduras, and that has something to do, it's not the core driver, but it has something to do with why Honduras has become such a hostile place for many people from there who ideally would like to stay there. Now, this is probably too small for you to see, but it's a chronology of natural either disasters or natural events, natural phenomena that we can all think of as drivers of migration in one way or another. I note towards the end, we begin to see the coffee rust epidemic and drought. And now there's the whole discussion of the so-called dry corridor in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, where agricultural lands 5-6 years into a drought have simply become unfruitful. And populations that had been living very meagerly, but living off of the land, are being driven out. And what they're doing is giving as collateral any belongings they have to coyotes to get them north, right? They've lost their land, they've lost the ability to raise any kind of income through parched lands, and they're moving north, right? So there's the natural disasters, the geographical location. There's also, and I think this is really fundamental, the question that colleagues and I refer to as social exclusion. That is to say, it's not only poverty, and I'll say something about poverty in a moment, but it's also the absence of any viable means of entry into labor markets. That is, places where one can earn one's livelihood, right? Jobs, but it's more than jobs. It's also even self-employment, generating through micro-entrepreneurship and so on. It's the closure of those options, coupled with the neglect from the state, the failure of the state to provide not only insurance, but also things like skills through basic education, nutrition. If you're looking at the Guatemalan case, where we now have close to half of the children under the age of 5 exhibiting malnutrition. Those are signs not just of poverty, but of social exclusion. It's a combination of no access in the market, labor markets, and no support from the state in the public arena. And the combination helps us to explain why people are driven to leave. And if you look at this graph, as this chart, which I think you can see from back there. Yeah. If you look just at the percentage of people living at under $3 or under $5.50 a day, you see it's about a third in El Salvador, close to half under $5.50 a day in both Guatemala and Honduras, $3.20 a day, a quarter and a third in Guatemala and Honduras. This is a desperate level of poverty. Note, by the way, that the Salvadoran number is considerably lower. That is to say, is better. And one of the things that is not commented on frequently enough is that the Salvadoran governments, inept though they were from 2009 to 18, first ever government by the Frente, the Front, which was the successor to the guerrillas in the war, was the political party that then vied for election. They were inept governments. They were failed governments. But one thing they actually did pretty well was insulation against the worst of poverty. The Salvadorans aren't migrating because of the worst of poverty. The Guatemalans are. And you see this further down when you look at the bottom, malnutrition percentage of children under 5, 46% of Guatemalan children under the age of 5, right? And what's the response of the Guatemalan government that was inaugurated last week? I was there. 2 weeks ago, I was there. They're cutting the health budget because they need to keep their fiscal accounts in balance, right? And I'll come to tax rates in a moment. They continue to be a country that is at the very bottom of the list in taxation as a percentage of wealth, right? You don't tax and you don't invest in access to food and the like. This is also a region of extreme violence. This particular slide, I won't go into detail, but it's something that isn't addressed enough. It certainly comes up in a lot of the asylum cases and the special immigrant juvenile status cases that we see in immigration courts. But if you ask a sociologist what happens when a household experiences intense violence in the public arena, the first answer is they retreat into the domestic arena because that's where safety is. And colleagues at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, with whom we had a project on social exclusion and violence, opened their study with that assumption. But by the end of the study, we had a different conclusion, which is that the problem in Central America has become, regardless of chicken or egg, which started when, is that the violence inside the household is such that it doesn't provide a refuge from intensive violence outside. And so that possibility of household as place of protection is much more tenuous than one would hope. And levels of domestic violence, this particular graph shows child abuse by country and gender, are off the charts and at epidemic levels. A lot of what gets attention, though, is questions of crime and violence. These graphs here show the trajectories in the homicide rate, which is a measurement of one kind of crime. Probably the more important measurement, and I don't think I have it in these slides, for understanding the immediate drivers of migration are actually extortion, which we'll get to in a moment. But homicide also tells us a fair amount. And what you'll see is rates reaching a point of, as we have now El Salvador roughly in the present at 50 homicides per 100,000 residents, 40 Honduras, 25 each in Mexico and Guatemala. But of course, Salvador was double that just a few years ago. It's come down quite a bit for a variety of reasons we could talk about. Honduras has also come down to 40s from 80. Now, of course, if you drill down to a local level and you look at some neighborhoods of the major cities, they're still way over 100 per 100,000. All of these, Mexico, Guatemala, and then doubling and quadrupling it, are considered by the WHO epidemic levels of homicide. But this is this kind of violence is one thing that's driving migration, and that has a lot to do with gangs. These numbers here are not useful; they're old. Here is something we got from a case where we were providing expert support for a kid who had been threatened by the gang that either you join the gang or we'll kill you. And I won't try to translate it, but those of you who know Spanish and can just kind of get a sense of this is what the kid comes carrying with him across by himself to the U.S. border, trying to get to his cousin in Rockville, who will protect him. This is what he had that said that, we're going to kill you, you're either going to join us, and so on. Notice how primitive this is, right? This is not a cartel from Colombia writing this, right? One of the things that's very crucial to understand about the phenomena of gang violence is these are poor people who are squeezing poor people to death, right? And this is, again, a note given by a gang member to a prospective gang recruit who becomes a gang target and flees to the United States. They're saying that if he doesn't work for them for $48 a week, they will kill him, and they'll kill him if he goes to the police, and then they'll kill his whole family. This is the kind of thing that we're seeing quite frequently in the Northern Triangle. And here, you'll see on the left, is a book from the International Crisis Group that refers to mafia of the poor, gang violence, right? These are mafias of the poor. They control territory. The whole idea is to control territory and the people within it, and you can carry out primarily extortion, but other things, car theft rackets, gasoline, theft and resale, all kinds of petty crime. Occasionally, you can also move some drugs for people or locate some drugs locally, but these are not the Zetas or sophisticated, really organized criminal groups as they operate at the local level, but they're brutally violent, right? And so if you live in those territories, you don't have access to the labor market. You don't have protection from the state for things like education, healthcare, so on. The resources you do have are relatives who've managed to get to the United States and are sending stuff back. You then get a circumstance where your neighborhood is being taken over by folks who are sending your kids those notes. You have nowhere to go, you send for the kid to come north. And that's an awful lot of what's going on. Or you send the family north. And that's a lot of what's going on. There are also serious problems having to do with the corruption of state institutions. Most notably in this regard, the fact that people can't go to the police. There is a sense, sometimes well-founded, sometimes not, but there's a sense that if I tell the police that I have a problem with the gang, they will tell the gang and they will protect me from the gang, and I and my family will be in trouble. That's sometimes true, sometimes not, but people are not unfounded in believing that may be true. And it's not a calculation you'd want to make mistakenly, right? So people don't go to the authorities for assistance. The authorities don't have resources, though the United States government tries to give assistance to security forces in hopes that they will develop those. But we also see many instances of poorly funded, technologically underdeveloped police forces entering into agreements with illegal groups, with criminal groups, and so on and so forth. And so there's a very serious problem of corruption at that level, though I will suggest in a few moments that that's not the core of the corruption problem. That is to say, at the level of police and so on. It has to do higher up in these systems. One other slide I have here that is just to give you a sense of how complicated this can be. We've had now a number of cases where attorneys have come to us asking for analysis of the plausibility of claims of particularly Salvadoran families, women, who arrive with children and say, we had to arrive because the gangs found out that my husband was in one of the anti-gang units for the police, right? And thus is taking out the whole family. And we're actually seeing a lot of these cases, right? So it's not, on the one hand, you have police and security forces that are quite corrupted and implicated in all kinds of problems. On the other hand, those same forces are incapable of protecting their own in the instances where they actually try to put in place more effective policies. one last thing I'll suggest is this is the trajectory of request for asylum from Central Americans, but not in the United States, right? There's a narrative out there that, well, all the Central Americans are coming because they just want to come to the United States, et cetera, right? And if we didn't have an open door, if Obama hadn't told them they would come, if somebody hadn't told them we can't put them in cages, then they wouldn't come, right? Well, this is interesting. This is to other countries. This is the trajectory of Northern Triangle family migrants, right? What that's telling you is people were trying to get out wherever they could go. Panama, Nicaragua. Nobody migrates to Nicaragua until around 2013-14, where we begin to see Salvadorans from areas that were not migrant sending walking into Nicaragua to get out of parts of Salvador that were being taken over by gangs. And so it just suggests that what we had during this period was people who felt they had to get out. And it's, I think, that argument about the combination of social exclusion and violence intersecting to help to explain that. Now, I want to now turn to some of the what can be done about this. And if I recall, I have 3 slides, I think. Yeah, I have 3 slides that suggest initiatives that have been taken. And then I want to go back to what I think is the underlying question I don't think those initiatives are going to be able to deal with. First, remember I situated this in the summer of 13 when there was the big flow of migrants at the time when there was the expectation of a possible immigration reform in the States. This was a big political problem for the Obama administration, and Obama designated Biden to fix this problem, right? And so Biden convened a meeting of the 3 Northern Triangle presidents at the time, this is them in the slide, in Washington at the Inter-American Development Bank to announce the plan that would finally solve this problem. And it was the plan for the Alliance for Prosperity for the Northern Triangle. And it was to initially be $1 billion from the US and $1 billion from the IDB, and this would be a down payment on finally solving the problem. And so it involves stimulating the productive sector to try to create job opportunities, building infrastructure, investing in public security, and so on and so forth. In the end, about 3/4 of the money was approved from the United States. The IDB has never come up with all of it. It kind of forgot about it for a while. And then it occasionally comes back with some more. The plan has not gone away. It keeps being mentioned, but it hasn't been aggressively implemented. What's interesting, though, it doesn't call into question anything particularly fundamental about the region. It just said if we did a little bit more in investing in institutions, we invest in some infrastructure, the private sector will be able to create jobs. It's not talking about a significant paradigm shift in terms of the development future of this region. It also, I would add, to think of $1 billion is going to solve the problems of a region with 40 million people that is in a situation of this dire institutional and social and political crisis is a bit naive. A second thing that has been attempted, and it's very interesting, was a series of anti-corruption and impunity programs. Now, what I mentioned a few moments ago was that the real problem of corruption in Central America isn't with a cop who is taking payouts from the gangs or a military guy who's giving weapons to the gangs. I mean, that's bad. It's very bad. It happens. And that's, again, development assistance can give weapons to the military, hope they don't sell them, right? Those are issues. But the real issues with corruption in Central America, I would argue, particularly in Guatemala and Honduras, are at the very highest levels of the state and have to do with the bankrupting of the state, awarding public monies to firms and individuals who do not perform what the firms and individuals are supposed to do. In the case of Honduras, U.S. federal prosecutors have echoed the basic charge that, and the president has acknowledged that his 2013 campaign was run with, in part, more than $100 million taken out of the National Social Security Institute. The former First Lady was jailed by the OAS and Honduran government Commission Against Impunity and Corruption for taking government funds while she was First Lady, setting them into a series of shadow NGOs for social services and pocketing that money. This is endemic. The current president of Honduras also was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Southern District of the U.S. Federal courts in a case that resulted in his brothers being convicted as an international narcotics kingpin 6 or 8 weeks ago, right? We're talking about, at the very highest levels of the state, the criminalization of political power, right? And Guatemala, the same thing. The president of Guatemala was investigated by the International Commission Against Impunity and Corruption in Guatemala, sponsored by the United Nations. In 2015, he was charged with running the largest criminal organization in the country that was essentially it controlled the customs section of the state. And so anything that came into customs, it was placing a tax on, going straight into the president, who would then send it out, right? And it's Tony Soprano. These organized criminal apparatuses that have taken over the state. Now, the international community, upset about migration, upset about other things, upset about violence, upset about epidemic homicide rates, imposed in Guatemala through the UN and in Honduras through the OAS. I shouldn't say the international community imposed. Popular uprisings denouncing this kind of criminal activity led to agreements between civil societies, governments, and UN in the Guatemalan case, OAS in the Honduran case, to put in place technical assistance and investigative capabilities that would support special units in prosecutors' offices and attorney general's offices in those countries to investigate high-level and systematic corruption and impunity. And if you look at, we just published a report on the 12 years of the Guatemalan Commission, extraordinarily successful, although an enormous amount of work remains to be done. Honduras, only 4 years, but quite successful with a lot of work to be done. What has been the fate of these? Last year, the President Morales in Guatemala became subject of investigation by the Anti-Impunity Commission, like his predecessor who was in jail. He and his brothers both became subject of the commission. He tried to shut it down. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional for him to shut it down. He shut down the Supreme Court. And the United States initially pushed hard that he had to keep the Anti-Corruption Commission. And then, interestingly, late last year, Guatemala entered into an agreement with the Trump administration whereby people who are being sent out of the United States while waiting to hear whether they'll be allowed in, whether they've been deported from Guatemala or anywhere else, can be sent to Guatemala, a safe third country. Guatemala signed the deal. The CICIG was shut down, and the Americans did not protest it. So the CICIG is no longer in Guatemala, and many of the prosecutors for the CICIG are contacting me and others in Montgomery County and elsewhere, asking whether they can move here because they and their families are being hunted. MOCSI, the Honduran Anti-Impunity Commission, it was announced last week that the Honduran president is no longer negotiating in good faith with the Secretary General of the Organization of American States for the renewal of MOCSI. He is insisting that immunity legislation that is being put forth in the Congress, whereby congressional officials would be immune from investigation from the MOCSI, has to remain. The OAS is not willing to go along with that. And so the MOCSI is also shutting down. And I also today had back and forths with the lead prosecutor for MOCSI, who was working with the Attorney General, under the Attorney General, but with the protection of the OAS. he's going to need to leave the country. So that's the problems of corruption. Right? It's not the street cop in the corner. That's a problem. It's not the soldier who sells a machine gun to a gangster. That's a problem. This is the real problem, right? And underneath this all, you have on the one hand, you have systems that are not providing mechanisms for social exclusion, for social inclusion. You have economic development models that don't go beyond the idea that, well, if we just invest a little bit more, if we build a few more highways, if we make a little bit cleaner institutions. And you have problems of the deeply embedded criminal structures in the highest levels of the state. You also go back to the question of what are those states for anyway, right? What do Central American states do? And here, and I'll close with this, is the total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. Guatemala's has gone down, it's about 10 now. The OECD countries, right, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, granted somewhat wealthier than most Latin American countries, but Brazil and Mexico, Chile, Uruguay are OECD countries. OECD country averages are about a third of national wealth is captured by the state for taxes, for things like education, health protection, policing, environmental protection, disaster mitigation, what have you. In Latin America, which is not as developed, it's less. It's about a fifth rather than a third. In a place like Guatemala, it's a tenth. Right? Honduras, it's less than a fifth. El Salvador, it's been coming up, but it's still around 16, 17%. If you don't build viable states in these countries, there's not going to be a mechanism to absorb population. Right? If you don't have effective domestic and international cooperation around rooting out criminal organizations from the core of the state, you're not going to resolve these problems. Right? And I think also you need to go considerably further than was done with the discussion of the plan for the Alliance of Prosperity. Again, $1 billion from the Americans, $1 billion from the IDB, never came up with that much. And of course, Trump pulled back it for a moment. Some of the money has technically been restored. Keep in mind that Mexico's President López Obrador, when he looked at this problem, and of course this is a huge problem for him because Mexicans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Hondurans go through Mexico to get to the United States, but now they're being told they have to stay in the United States, and if they don't stay in the United States, Mexico's going to face tariffs that will take down its economy. And so López Obrador has no choice but to become a innkeeper for people who are in transit in limbo, perhaps coming to the States, perhaps staying in Mexico. He doesn't have the institutions capable of doing that, but he has no choice. And what he has said is, well, he wants to be part of a $30 billion, not $1 billion or $2 billion if you were to do that, $30 billion. Well, that would be a step in the direction, but we're talking about that scale of what's really needed to make these prosperous societies, to make these societies where people, there's a phrase that I think is very apt to think about, which is the right not to migrate. Right? There are a lot of people who don't have the right, they don't have the option not to migrate. Right? And serious investment in institutions and in states will be needed for that to change. So anyway, I don't know, I may have taken too long, but I was trying to do a lot. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Well, I'm listening to you, and as you go on, it just seems to get worse and worse. And I wonder if what's the root of the whole problem? Because if you throw money there, it doesn't help. It's just going to be used for something wrong. But can't the people who live there do something? I mean, what is the root of the problem? Can't the people solve it themselves? Because if they just keep migrating to other countries, nothing's ever going to be right.
I think the root of the problem has to do, and this actually, I'm glad you asked the question, Ellie, because it goes back to what I started at the beginning about how I got involved in this. Is I was working with Central American economists who I've known for a long time, and we were trying to get a handle on how is it that the Central American elite operate, right? How do these economies work? And I'll tell you actually where this came from.
Can you explain when you say the elite?
Yeah.
Explain which
Okay.
classes you're talking
Right.
about.
So, back up for a second. You all remember, many of you will remember, if you're my age or older, you'll remember, how in the 1980s, there were the Central American Wars, the Nicaraguan Revolution and the backlash, the Salvadoran. There was a basic framework that social scientists and people experiencing that process understood for why Central America got to where it was, right? And it was that these were agrarian societies, right? In Nicaragua, it was coffee, cotton, and cattle, right? In Salvador, it was coffee, right? In Guatemala, it was largely coffee and sugar, right? These were agrarian economies, they're plantation economies. The 14 families in El Salvador, supposedly, who controlled the whole country. X number, small numbers of families, oligarchs, elites. Think southern plantation United States of the 19th century, right? Pre-Civil War, or post. So these are plantation economies. Very small number of landowners who have everything, and a vast number of people who have absolutely nothing. And you can let those people grow corn and beans on a little plot of land. You can even let them call it their own. But you have to have them poor enough so that when it comes harvest time, you can demand that they show up, right? And so you have extremely poor peasants who live with limited amounts of land, and the combination of that land and the labor that they get in harvest season. And that was the basic political economy of the region. Small number of elites who are agrarian elites, right? Now, what do the agrarian elites do if there's a rebellion about that and we want to have a land reform and take part of those lands and divide them up so that people can enter into markets? Well, that's why you have a military, right? And you often had military governments in Central America. Again, I'm painting a stylized picture here, but this was the model we had of governance in mid-20th century, much of the 20th century, Central America, that broke down when you had popular uprisings. And the military clamped down, and there was popular revolutionary uprisings, Nicaragua, Salvador, and so on. I'm oversimplifying. These things happened in part because of the emergence of urban middle sectors who were reformist and so on. But the basic stylized model was that this was an oligarchic agrarian economy that depended on the subordination of mass labor force in the countryside. And so how do you make that change? You have to figure out some other mechanism for driving an economy. And of course, what motivated me to begin this work 8 or 10 years ago was that actually after the wars, that model we had is no longer right? What happens to the 14 families who are generating all their wealth around coffee and its processing and its marketing in El Salvador? They leave the land during the war. They give up. They give it away. They walk away. Right? And they move to the cities, and they control, once they control the national government, they privatize banks and they become bankers. And then once they get done with that, they sell the banks to Scotiabank and HSBC and a few others, and they do very, very well. And they then move into payment processing, which is really convenient if those folks who used to work the land, right? They used to work the land, they're now gradually migrating north. And then remittances are what drives that. And so you become the people who run the remittance apparatus, right? You get shopping malls in the cities, right? So I was trying to understand in our new line of research, what do the elites do now, which is quite different from that old agricultural idea, right? The answer to what needs to be done is you need to figure out ways in which those who are driving those economies, who have the resources in those economies, invest them in ways that make possible the deepening, the broadening of social inclusion and the deepening of institutions. Right?
Could they start something different besides farming?
But I asked the people who did questions to stand up.
And then we want other people
Yeah.
to be able to
Could
ask
they
too.
start something different like technology and build different types of, things for things we need in the future? That's what's happening now with people losing jobs because robots are taking over. Could they start something through education?
Certainly, education's got to be a priority. Diversification of the economy has to be a priority. It's interesting you mentioned automation. There's a lot of concern. Where is the one place where there's been an expansion in jobs in Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador over the last 15 years? The one place? Manufacturing. And what kind of manufacturing? Maquila assembly manufacturing in special exporting zones, right? And in garments, low-level electronics, various kinds of assembly operations. What is most automatable of all. And so there's actually some concern amongst economists in Central America that it's not wealthy countries that should be especially worried about automation. They're really worried about it. And I don't know enough about the innovation economics to know how persuaded I am that Google's going to be driving all trucks and all of that. But they're thinking about what goes on in apparel assembly, for example. And at what point, I spoke to actually the leading industrialist in El Salvador a year ago. And I asked him about this. He says, no, I'm not going to use robots. First, my labor is very cheap. I don't pay them very much. And secondly, and there's an endless supply, right? I mean, it's underemployment is such, he doesn't have problem finding workers. And he says, and I built a factory that is designed for today's machinery. So even if I could go out and buy robots, why would I, since I've already got the sunk cost? And it would be decades before it was worth my time, my investment to go out. And I just don't know what to make of that. But I'm just saying automation is not necessarily going to be cost-free in this part of the world. Let me take some more. Yes?
I was just curious what the role,
Can you stand up so everybody can hear you?
what the role of the U.S. government was in supporting the elites, whether that was in the 80s and even in their metamorphosis. I mean, what's the interface there?
Well, I mean, the Americans supported, the American objective in the 80s and before that, in the 60s, 70s, and so on, was to make sure there were no second Cubas, right? That was the fundamental American agenda in this part of the world. And what that meant was you wanted there to be reforms, particularly beginning with the Kennedy administration, the Alliance for Progress. You want reforms, you want education, you want healthcare, you want opportunity for people, because if you don't, they'll become revolutionaries and we'll have more Cubas. And so the Americans, through the 60s and 70s, encouraged modest and gradual reforms to varying degrees of success. I would say, for example, Costa Rica and Panama don't fit into the Central America frame now, in part because, for reasons independent, but also for that reason, they've done quite well. Okay? And Costa Rica, with support from the United States government and its own wisdom, has done very well in attracting technology, much more diversified economy, so on and so forth. But while what you wanted, therefore, was reform, if you were getting revolution, what you did was invest in repression, right? And that's what we had in the Nicaraguan case, where they lost and the revolution won. In the Salvadoran case, where what they got was a stalemate, which meant a brutal civil war, eventually with a negotiated settlement between the guerrillas and the elite. And in Guatemala, what you got was a massacre. Because in Guatemala, there never really was a significant insurgency. And the Guatemalan elite would not be surpassed in its brutality, and the army would not be surpassed in its brutality. And it was the population in which the majority in the countryside where this counterinsurgency was fought was indigenous. And so that's where the genocide took place, and more than 200,000 people were killed. The Americans supported the Salvadoran military throughout the Civil War. They supported first Somoza and then the Contras in Nicaragua. They backed off in the Guatemalan case. And in fact, the Guatemalan elites have never forgiven the Americans for this. And this is part of the reason why the Guatemalan elites at the end were prepared to get rid of secede, even if the Americans wanted them to stay. There's a degree of autonomy between the Guatemalan elite and Washington. At times, Washington's been able to push them, but at times, they've been further than the U.S. would go. I would say, so the United States has not always been a constructive presence in the region. Sometimes it's been a very destructive presence in the region. I think it's very hard to imagine a future for Central America. Well, it's impossible to imagine what Central America's future will be without thinking how the United States fits into it, right? I mean, a third of the population of El Salvador lives in the United States. And you can't understand what drives the Salvadoran economy, the population flows, electoral dynamics, and so on. So what goes on here is going to be fundamental for the future of that country. Trade in the region, economic activity in the region maps very closely on what goes on in the U.S. economy. Possibilities for investment. And then you just look at what the implications are of migration policies now. And this is why the Guatemalan and Honduran governments agreed to declare their countries safe havens for asylum seekers. That includes asylum seekers from Cuba, from Cameroon, from wherever. Right? That's what was agreed upon, is that we can just send them people from wherever, that they're going to be safe to sit in Guatemala and Honduras. Now, why does Guatemala or Honduran state agree to that? Partly it's because if they don't, they're going to keep the CICIG and they'll investigate me and my brother. In part, it will be they'll keep the MOXIE and so on. But it's fundamentally because these countries have got to have the United States on their side. The newly elected president of El Salvador, Bukele, made clear that in his campaign and subsequent to coming into office, that he would never do anything that would do anything other than maintain close ties with the Americans, because it would be suicide for El Salvador to not have perfect ties with the Americans.
Okay, a couple more
Yes.
questions. Yes?
Let me take several, because
Okay, quick answers.
that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
So thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first question is, can you talk a little bit more about the indigenous peoples and migration, especially in the Guatemalan case?
Yeah.
Are we seeing huge numbers, small numbers, no numbers? My second question is about CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. What are your perspectives? Was it useful, useless? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me take some more. Yes.
My question is, wouldn't it be helpful if the U.S. buys more goods from these three countries and sends more funds to these three countries instead of cutting funds back like this administration has done?
Mm-hmm.
And also, which one of the three countries has the most corruption and crime? Is it El Salvador?
No.
No? Which one?
Okay, he's taking questions.
Okay.
You had a slide about family kind of violence, and in different countries, some violence was more against the male son, and the countries were more against the female. Is there a cultural difference in terms of how different countries view males and females?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Following up on your comments about El Salvador, what's the impact of the money that's being sent back by TPS workers here to the economy in El Salvador? And if they are forced to go back to El Salvador, there will no longer be that influx of money, and there won't be the jobs for these people. So what impact is that going to have?
Should I go with those? One more.
I'm told that, a lot of people think Mexicans are the Hispanic-speaking people around, Latin Americans, that most of them are El Salvadorians.
Well,
The
certainly in this,
metropolitan area.
no, the Washington, D.C. metro area is unique in the United States in that the largest group of migrants are Central Americans, and within that Salvadorans. There's no other place like that in the United States. It is the case, though, there are more Salvadorans in LA than in DC, but as a percentage of the overall, right? Next would be Houston, I believe. We've done some really interesting, it's too bad that my colleague Dennis Stinchcomb had another thing tonight. Dennis has written a lot of this stuff, and the stuff that's on migration, he writes with me. And he would be the person who could answer the question on the gender division of, I lose track of it. Yes, the gender division of domestic violence. He's the one who's looked a lot more at the internal dynamics in the households. But he and I have done work, we've published some work, and he did a lot of the field work, where we looked at the ways in which communities were providing legal services, access to schooling, and health and social services for Central Americans who'd migrated since 2013. And we had big studies in the DC metro area and the Houston metro area, which were two of the three largest places to receive Central American migrants. We also looked at the Carolinas, which is a very interesting contrast because you had a population, but you didn't have what you had in DC, which was a long period for places like Montgomery County to develop policies and programs that would meet the needs of a new immigrant population. So I can't get everything, but just a couple. Remittances, that is the money that migrants send back. That's the main thing that Salvador produces, right? I mean, about close to 20% of Salvador's gross domestic product is represented by money that Salvadorans send back to their family, primarily family, to some extent to invest in businesses, but mostly to provide for everyday consumption, education, healthcare, for those of their family who remain behind. So remittances are absolutely fundamental. The one thing I would say is the way you framed it is so if we got rid of TPS, those folks would go back and those resources would be no longer provided. I think there's a whole bunch of assumptions in that. There are assumptions that I hear a lot in El Salvador, right? But number one, do you think those people are going to go back just because TPS got full? Not very many people are going to go back. First, they're going to go, as a friend of mine who's had TPS for 15 years, he says, you got to be kidding. He says, I'm going to first appeal, and I'm going to this, I'm going to ask for asylum, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then Trump might still be there, and then maybe he won't, and then I'll appeal, and then we're going to be 5 or 8 years out. And then if that doesn't work, I'll try to get in through my wife, and she's got a different status. People, first of all, are not just going to say, oh, okay, I'll go back to El Salvador, right? One. Two, people may decide to go elsewhere, right? And in the meantime, they're not going to stop sending remittances, right? Because they've got families who are relying on those remittances, right? Their mothers aren't going to stop needing that $15 or $20 to make ends meet just because they're now not with the TPS as the form of their working documentation, right? So there's all kinds of projections, but I don't want to downplay, minimize at all how important TPS was. But it's also not the case that that's just going to result in. I do have to say one anecdote, which years ago, the Salvadoran ambassador to the United States, Pablo Alchu, a very thoughtful man, who was here for a number of years as the ambassador, told me that it was ironic to him that he had run the numbers on how much Salvadoran workers had paid to the United States government in the fees that they paid every 18 months to get their TPS renewed. He said it was more than the sum of all development assistance from the United States to El Salvador for the entire period. So all the assistance, we've paid it back with our workers there who had to go every 18 months and demonstrate that they were employed, that they had never had any problems. They've been doing it now for 18 years, 20 years, $600 every 18 months. If you add it up, it was more than the United States had given in development assistance.
And the indigenous
And they've been
question.
paid. Okay, the indigenous question. This is primarily a question for Guatemala, and it's very relevant. The trends, had I shown you, and again, Dennis is really good at it, had I shown you the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, I could take this map. If you look at the map of Central America, whoops, it didn't do it. Yes, that's what I wanted it to do. We've got data that will show the relative origin, Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, at different points in time over the last 5 to 10 years of the migrants coming in. And you can see ebbs and flows that are quite interesting. The numbers from Salvador, for example, have been relatively lower over the last couple of years. And there's some debate about why. The Honduran have been relatively stable. Guatemala has spiked. Guatemala has spiked, and it's overwhelmingly rural from the highlands. And as much as immigration attorneys would like me to help them to make the case that people are fleeing those regions because they're being persecuted on the grounds of their indigenous identity, or that they are being directly targeted for torture or the like by criminal organizations or by the state, the reason they're leaving is they're hungry. Right? They're hungry. Serious problems of hunger, and all across the country where communities are receiving Central American migrants. And of course, keep in mind, there's something like 3/4 of the Central Americans who migrate to roughly 10 or 15 metropolitan areas, right, where you have population concentrations. And where you see significant influx of Guatemalan population in recent years, heavily indigenous, often non-Spanish speaking, and with real problems of food security that are driving the migration and once they're here. I mean, we did work in Montgomery County and found Guatemalan households in real trouble. And so indigeneity is really important. There are issues of discrimination inside Guatemala. These are people who are, they're agricultural households and communities. They're experiencing extraordinary drought, extraordinary crop failure, complete state abandonment, and populations are coming here with no other option, and they're getting here in bad shape. It is not an accident, though. The cases of children who've died in Customs Border Patrol, DHS security, if not all of them, most of them have been indigenous kids who first came in bad shape. I mean, I'm not speaking to each case, but there's a pattern where they came quite weakened. They had a very difficult journey. They fell ill. They weren't able to communicate in Spanish. So there's real issues of indigeneity and exclusion where they intersect. About CAFTA, the one thing I would say is it seems to me, CAFTA is consistent with that logic of we need to increase trade, we need to increase investment. That's all true. But a 20% increase in trade, a 10% increase in investment, so on, isn't going to help. Someone asked me, I asked someone about, remember I mentioned, and I'll end with this, that it was November of 14 when the Alliance for the Prosperity is agreed upon with the IDB and the Obama administration. And in the subsequent months, one didn't hear that much about it. And the crisis at the border seemed to have ebbed a little bit. It wasn't as much in the headlines. Obama wasn't as upset about it. The president of the Inter-American Development Bank had been reelected with the support from all of the governments involved, including the Americans and the Central American governments. And then you didn't hear much about it. No, IDB money wasn't flowing. And I asked somebody who I knew, I said, well, what do you think you make of that? And he says, well, you imagine you're the president of the IDB. I look at the region, I look at the election happening, and what do I have here? And he looked at that picture that I showed you of the Central American presidents.
So the IDB, right, is the Inter-American Development Bank,
Yeah, so
and a big funder of development projects.
and critical for resolving these issues in the long run, right? But I think if I can figure out how to get this to go where I want it to. This picture of Vice President Biden here. This is Otto Perez Molina, who was arrested and charged by the CC with running a criminal apparatus from the president's office. This is the president of the American Development Bank, Moreno. This is Salvador Sanchez Serén, the hapless, not corrupt, but hapless president of Guatemala. And this is the person who's the unindicted co-conspirator in the cocaine trafficking case in the U.S. federal court. One person said to me jokingly that he looks out at this and he says, what do I have? I have 2 thieves and a sick guy. So are you going to, I got 2 thieves and a sick guy. Are you going to, and so CAFTA is not going to solve that. And it goes back to the question of elites, and we need to have a national project to develop these economies and polities in the public good. And that's something that elites in the region have to do, and that, yes, the United States has to be part of helping them to do it.
Okay, thank you so much. We learned a lot, and
It's always hard trying to do lots of things, and I don't know what to.
Here's a little gift.
Oh, thank you. It's very nice.
Thank you,
so much.
everybody, for coming. You know, the International Relations Committee is working definitely on the same subject, but we've been given lots of good information and impulse to continue because of this great information that we received. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.